Thank you, Madam Speaker. I will be splitting my time with the member for Langley Township, Fraser Heights. Madam Speaker, I rise to speak on Bill C-4, the Liberals' so-called Making Life More Affordable for Canadians Act. After 10 years of these Liberals, Canadians are facing an unprecedented cost of living crisis. In the 10 years that these Liberals have been in power, housing costs have doubled, rent has doubled, mortgage costs have more than doubled, food prices have skyrocketed. Indeed, the recently released Canadian Food Price Report reveals that the average Canadian family will pay $800 more in groceries this year compared to last year. This, as a record 2 million Canadians per month are lined up at the food bank, and more than half of Canadians are $200 or less away from insolvency. Now, in the face of this cost of living crisis, the Liberals act as though they are mere bystanders. But the fact of the matter is that a big part of the reason why we are facing this cost of living crisis is because of the failed and costly policies of these Liberals over the past 10 years. Let's look at the record. This is a government that has presided over a fire hose of reckless spending and money printing that has fueled inflation. It is no accident that quite recently inflation had hit a 40-year high. This is a government that pummeled everyday Canadians with a punitive carbon tax that increased the cost of everything, including essentials such as food, fuel, and home heating. This is a government that year after year increased payroll taxes and other taxes and imposed costly new regulations. And this is a government that has managed to spend tens of billions of dollars building bureaucracy instead of the homes that Canadians need, completely failing to address the supply shortage within the housing market. So, in the face of that disastrous record, here we are debating what the Liberals are selling as the solution to the cost of living crisis that they bear so much responsibility for creating. The best that can be said of this bill is that it is an admission of failure on the part of the Liberals combined with a series of half measures. Take the carbon tax, an admission of failure. This bill repeals the consumer carbon tax. Now, if there was one policy that has been the legacy of this government over the past 10 years, it's arguably been the carbon tax. These Liberals said that the carbon tax was absolutely essential, that it was the best policy tool available to combat climate change, which they purport to be the biggest crisis of our lifetime. But not only that, the Liberals said that Canadians were actually better off paying the carbon tax. Why? Because the Liberals claimed that Canadians got more money back in the way of rebates than they paid in the carbon tax. Now, if that were true, then why would the Liberals be repealing that very carbon tax as part of their so-called Making Life More Affordable for Canadians Act? The Liberals can't have it both ways. Either Canadians were better off or worse off because of the carbon tax. This represents an admission of guilt on the part of the Liberals that for years they were misleading Canadians about the carbon tax, and that Conservatives were right all along, that the carbon tax was fueling inflation and increasing the cost of everything, contributing to the cost of living crisis. And I've got to say, with respect to the Prime Minister himself, that he likes to portray himself as someone who's very different than Justin Trudeau. But when it comes to the consumer carbon tax, the Prime Minister was one of the architects of the carbon tax as an advisor to Justin Trudeau, wherein the Prime Minister said that it was absolutely the right policy. And not only that, that it represented a model for the world to follow. And now he's done a complete 180. And so it is an admission by the Prime Minister that he got it wrong all along, and that the central key policy of the past 10 years of these Liberals was a complete failure. Now, while it's an admission of failure by the Liberals, we say it is also a half measure to repeal the consumer carbon tax. It is our position that the Liberals should repeal the industrial carbon tax. The Prime Minister's policy is to maintain that punitive tax and to continue to increase that tax year after year until 2030. It is a tax that undermines Canada's competitiveness. It is a tax that disadvantages key sectors of the economy. This at a time when sectors of the economy are grappling with 25% and 50% U.S. tariffs, tariffs that the U.S. ambassador said today are likely to remain in place for the foreseeable future. So here you have a Prime Minister who wraps himself around the Canadian flag and claims to be a great champion of the Canadian economy and Canadian workers. And here he is hitting key sectors over the head with a carbon tax hike on top of U.S. tariffs. The Prime Minister's policy, combined with U.S. tariffs, threatens to drive entire sectors such as steel and aluminum and other heavy industrial sectors out of Canada, and with that, it will cost Canadian jobs. And so it is why Conservatives are calling on the Liberals to axe the tax on everything for everyone for good, including the industrial carbon tax. And speaking of half measures, there is then the Liberals' so-called middle-class tax cut. It is literally a half measure insofar as it is half of the tax cut that the Liberals promised in the recent election campaign. We're 2 weeks into this Parliament, and the Liberals are already breaking key election commitments. So small, by the way, is this so-called middle-class tax cut that the savings that Canadians would realize would barely be enough to pay for a cup of coffee each week. It's hardly a middle-class tax cut. It's really nothing more than a gimmick, and I would note that less than a cup of coffee a week is really next to nothing in the face of the average Canadian family who is now paying $10,000 more in taxes than when the Liberals came to office. So, Madam Speaker, yes, there are some half measures in this bill that we can support, but that's the best that can be said of the bill. Half measures and an admission of failure and an admission of guilt of the past 10 years of the Liberals' carbon tax policy.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm a little bit disappointed in the member in the sense that I would have expected him to be a little bolder in terms of whether or not he actually supports the legislation. If the member takes and reflects on the last federal election, I think that it's virtually unanimous to the extent of everyone would concur, affordability was an issue. And this was an election promise made by the Prime Minister to deliver a tax break to the people of Canada. 22 million people, Madam Speaker, are going to benefit by this tax break. Yet, for some reason, the Conservatives just don't want to say whether or not they'll support the legislation. We need to get the legislation passed so that Canadians in every region of the country, all 22 million plus, will benefit by it being implemented before July 1. Does the Conservative Party support the initiative to get this thing passed before the end of June?
The Honourable Member for St. Albert Sturgeon River.
Madam Speaker, what Conservative support is real tax relief for Canadians. That would be abolishing, axing completely the entire carbon tax. That would mean a real middle-class tax cut, not a tax cut that results in savings that work out to roughly a coffee per week, and it includes a real cut in terms of a GST on new homes, not the watered-down version, but copying and pasting from our Conservative platform. So yes, we support relief for Canadians. They need it now, but this bill falls short.
Questions et commentaires. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Edmonton West.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for his usual well-researched speech. From the Liberal platform they announced during the election, it shows that this tax cut would cost the government about $5 billion a year in lost revenue. Yet at the same time, they've massively increased by a larger amount the amount of money they're going to give out to their friends at McKinsey, GC Strategies, and other high-priced connected Liberal consulting firms. I wonder if my colleague could tell us what he thinks of the Liberal priority of giving taxpayers' money to the McKinseys of the world and not the average Canadian family.
Member for St. Albert Sturgeon River.
Well, Madam Speaker, it demonstrates that this current Prime Minister represents a continuation of the same with this government, because that has been one of the defining features of the Liberals, which has been to pad the pockets of their friends, of Liberal insiders. We saw that with McKinsey. We saw that with the $400 million green slush fund that seized Parliament last fall, and we see the same with this budget.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Nunavut.
I'm going to ask the member a similar question that I asked earlier in C4, where it seeks to amend portions of the Elections Act, which has nothing to do with affordability, and I wonder what his thoughts are on that.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert's Sturgeon River.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I take the honourable member's point that it would have been more appropriate to have provided those amendments in the form of a separate piece of legislation. With regards to the substance of Part 4, the amendments to the Canada Elections Act, I do support those amendments to have a uniform system in place with respect to privacy laws falling exclusively under federal jurisdiction as they pertain to federal political parties.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Yorkton Melville, a brief question.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We've heard that they are going to be removing the carbon tax, which is called a consumer tax. However, I'd like my colleague to speak to the fact that it's actually a retail carbon tax, which they're replacing with an industrial carbon tax, which ultimately impacts the consumer, and whether he thinks that will impact the cost of these homes that they're taking the GST off of, but probably increasing the overall cost. Regardless.
Honourable Member for St. Albert Sturgeon River, a very brief answer.
Well, Madam Speaker, the bottom line is that the Prime Minister's commitment to increase the industrial carbon tax not only undermines Canada's competitiveness, but the costs borne will be passed on to consumers. So Canadians will in fact be paying more, not less, as a result of this Prime Minister's industrial carbon tax hike.